All right, this is like the Tonight Show. You come in from the back here. That was a lovely introduction. As we say in Amherst, it could be you have the wrong Reverend Jackson. I'm not sure I fitted the description. A couple of years ago, I was at an award ceremony for a group of people lifting them up on the bootstraps, and one person receiving the honor said to his wife, "Darling, in your wildest dreams, did you ever imagine that I could be getting an award of this kind?" And she said, "Darling, I don't know quite how to convey this to you, but you're not in my wildest dreams." Well, I rarely say this, but it is a distinct honor. It wasn't in my wildest dreams to be asked to offer the keynote to this group, which I've known from the very beginning because the founders were dearest friends. There's the magical Louise Tellez, who makes everything happen, my dear Robbie George, whom I met when he was 32, and that was 32 years ago, and the irresistible Jeff Bell, the dearest friend and most committed to the politics of truth. And the line that always lingers for me with Jeff Bell was when we were on the way to see Rick Santorum to see if we could get him to introduce into the Senate our Born Alive Infants Protection Act. And Jeff said, with a word that lingers, "We're looking for the man who's willing to pull the trigger, the one who had the nerve to act." And in Rick, of course, we found him. But right now, as a living memorial to Jeff, nothing could be truer or more beautiful than that valiant campaign that Nick Bell ran for the legislature in Virginia. He was running against a perfect storm, not of his making, but that may be the beginning of a vacation in politics. They'll begin now to unfold to the delight of this family. And when I think of the family who come together in support of this project, I think of a story told by my late friend, the dear Alan Bloom, who wrote The Closing of the American Mind. Remember Alan? He told the story of a Jewish salesman, peddler, who was caught in a shtetl in Russian Poland just as sundown was coming on the Sabbath. Couldn't get home, and he went to daven at the local synagogue, and the rabbi said, "Why don't you just stay with me tonight? Leave your things with me, and you could leave at sundown tomorrow." He said, "But Rabbi, I've been doing a lot of business. I have a satchel here with 10,000 zlotnies." "It's all right, just leave them with me." Well, they stayed, he prayed. Sundown came, he was ready to go, and he said, "Thanks the rabbi," and he said, "It's all right, my son, come again." "Fine. Rabbi, my satchel." "Satchel? I never called a satchel." He says, "Shmuel, you were here. Did you see me take a satchel with slot?" No. "Yitzchok, you were here. Did you see me take it?" No. At this point, the rabbi opened the desk, pulled out the satchel. He said, "It's not the money. I just want to show you what kind of a congregation I have." Well, I think you can see the kind of congregation we have assembled in this project. Now, Frank Cannon urged me tonight to speak to this line that's taken hold among many of our friends, that politics is downstream from the culture, that we must change the culture first, and what that view misses is the classic understanding, coming down from the first books on politics, that the culture may be shaped most decisively through the moral teaching of the laws. Anyone of my age knows that for the past 50 years, the Supreme Court has been the most powerful engine in transforming what passes as our culture on matters such as abortion, pornography, contraception, and now marriage. To talk about the change in the culture without talking of the Supreme Court and the laws, it's rather like using an old line. It's rather like playing Hamlet without the first gravedigger. And so I would take my entry into the problem of the story that's become less familiar to students over the years, a passage from that story in the Bible the 2 Samuel, the story of David and Bathsheba and Nathan. You may recall that David was quite drawn to Bathsheba. And so for the worst motive, he put her husband, Uriah, in harm's way in a battle so that he could be killed. David could have access to Bathsheba. And as the story unfolds, the Lord sent the prophet Nathan to David and offered him this story. There were two men in the city, one rich, the other poor. The rich man had exceeding many flocks and herds. The poor man had nothing save one little ewe lamb. A traveler came, a wayfarer, and the rich man, instead of taking of his own flock, just took that one little ewe lamb of his neighbor. And on hearing this story, David's anger was greatly kindled, and he said, "As the Lord liveth, the man that has done this deserveth to die." And Nathan said to David, as many of you remember, Nathan said to David, "Well, thou art the man. You're the one." Now the question we put to students is, well, why did he do it that way? Why did he cast the matter in impersonal terms? And with that move, he brought to his side the universal logic of a moral judgment. He's trying to describe the nature of the wrong, and for whom was it wrong to do such a thing? When we say it is wrong for some men to hold others as slaves, for whom would it be wrong? With the moral voice, we say it would be wrong for anyone, for everyone. We're dealing here with the logic of morals. And when we move to the level of a moral proposition on rights and wrongs, we move radically away from statements of merely personal taste and private belief. We begin to speak about the things that are more generally, universally right or wrong, good or bad, for others as well as ourselves. Nathan drew in David to acknowledge that he would call that act wrong regardless of who did it. And then it merely remained for Nathan to point out, well, that someone happens to be you. Now, I raised this matter with my students just to point out that the logic was there, long recognized, before analytic philosophers had the wit to start pointing up that logic of morals. And it has another utility for me in dealing with people, like that one student I had years ago who suggested that the logic of morals was something I invented myself in the 60s for the sake of ruining his weekends in the 70s. That logic becomes filled out when it's combined with Aquinas' first law of practical reasoning, that the good is that which we're obliged to do, and the bad or wrong are the things which we're obliged to refrain from doing. So if it's wrong to torture infants, it's the kind of thing which we're obliged to refrain from doing, the kind of thing that we may rightly be restrained from doing and punished for doing. Okay? And so once we come to the recognition that the torturing of a child stands in the class of a wrong, we lay the ground for forbidding that torturing more generally or universally, which is to say, we forbid it with the force of law. And there, in its core, we have Aristotle's connection between the logic of morals and the logic of law. We have law only because we have that capacity to reason over matters of right and wrong. And that's the key as well to the question of how does the political order cultivate the moral condition of its own people? And the answer was, it teaches through the laws. So when we passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, how do you feel about it? And we forbade discrimination on the basis of race, even in private businesses open to transactions with the public. We removed that act of discrimination from the domain of private choice and treated it as a rule of justice that we're warranted in imposing uniformly through the laws. On whom was that law enforced? It was enforced universally on everyone who came within the description of the law. At the time the Civil Rights Act was passed, we found majorities of around 70% in the North in favor of the act, and majorities of the same dimension in the South against the act and favoring private rights of choice. 3 years later, by 1966, we found parallel, heavy majorities, North and South, in support of that act. Now, what had happened? Had the culture of the South changed so dramatically within a space of 3 years? Or did it have something to do with the fact that some strikingly different moral lessons were being taught at the top of the state through the laws, and those lessons were being absorbed by people in the weave of their daily acts. That logic of moral judgment has become so woven in the understanding and practice of law that we're hardly aware any longer of the connection. But we may well ask, how have we come to a state of affairs in which accomplished lawyers, drawn from the priciest schools, can treat moral questions as though they were somehow extrinsic or peripheral to the main business of the law? Okay. Well, the answer comes with Justice Holmes, when he famously said in The Path of the Law that every word of moral significance should be banished from the law altogether, and with that language properly purged, we'd have the ingredients for a purified legal science. He was expressing something very much in the air, so as James Hergé remarked. By the end of the 19th century, the leading jurists had practically turned all responsibility for questions of morality over to the non-lawyers. Moralists, he said, were not interested in law, and lawyers were not interested in morality. That this understanding came to be deeply absorbed by lawyers trained in the best schools was reflected amply enough in that line of Judge John Newman in Connecticut, which was picked up and trumpeted by Justice Brennan in the 1970s, where Newman said that abortion and childbirth, when stripped of the sensitive moral arguments surrounding the abortion controversy, are simply two alternative medical methods of dealing with pregnancy. One might as aptly say that stripped of the moral differences, a fireplace and arson are just different ways of heating a house. To strip the words of moral significance from the two acts simply removes the ground for any judgment of whether the acts in either case may be justified or unjustified, rightful or wrongful. But then we found Justice Breyer falling into the same construction. Just a year ago, in the NIFLA case, National Institute of Family and Life Advocates versus Becerra, the question there was whether a pro-life counseling organization could be compelled to give its clients information on where they could obtain abortions at a subsidized cost. The pro-life group did not want to be in the position of facilitating abortions. The case was argued under the banner of coercing speech, dictating the content of speech. But as Justice Breyer pointed out, and Justice Breyer conceded, every measure that required information to be given to patients or customers was a regulation that imposed obligations of speech and on the content of speech as well. For Breyer, that set up the clincher. And so he said, if a state can lawfully require a doctor to tell a woman seeking an abortion about adoption services, why should it not be able, as here, to require a medical counselor to tell a woman seeking prenatal care about childbirth and abortion? And that would indeed be the clincher if one understood that abortion and childbirth stood on precisely the same moral plane as equally plausible and legitimate. That was the argument that my dear friend Clarence Thomas had to meet in order to make his case and justify his judgment. But he did not meet that argument, nor did his conservative colleagues offer any help here, because the majority did not move to the point of explaining that elementary point of why childbirth and abortion may not stand on the same moral plane. At different times in the past, the court had said that even with the right to abortion planted in the law, a legislature could favor the protection of life over the choice of killing the child. Chief Justice Rehnquist had invoked that awful term, a value judgment. He said that abortion may be a private choice, but that government may make a, quote, value judgment favoring childbirth. But it was possible to take a step beyond this matter of value judgments. Once again, without overruling Roe versus Wade, Justice Thomas could have supplied the most elementary natural law argument here on why death just cannot stand as a rival good to that of life. John Finnis used to make that point. John Finnis used to make that point in those familiar examples of everyday life. We look both ways when we cross a street. We have drives to collect food to relieve starvation. The crew of an ambulance sets off with the motive of rescuing the victim, not putting him to his death in order to spare his family from hard choices. On one of my own favorite stories, a teacher is told that as fire is broken out in the school building, she's directed to get those children out of her classroom on the 3rd floor, and so she starts throwing them out the window. Did she really have to be told not to do it that way? Don't we rather assume that she knows that of course she should get them out of the building in a way that secures their lives and safety? The point is so obvious to any functional person, yet it is so obvious that we are hardly aware any longer that we know it. We're dealing with those things so fundamental, as Jay Budashevsky says, that we cannot not know them. Or as Dan Robinson said, we're just compelled to take them for granted. What so many lawyers haven't yet understood is that the natural law finds its ground in those deep axioms of common sense that form the ground of our practical judgments. It's not a scheme of some foggy, high-flying theories floating in the sky. It would take a little strain for the conservative majority to have set down those simple points as the ground of meeting Stephen Breyer's challenge in dissent. And I think Justice Thomas could have done it without losing Justice Kennedy. That Justice Thomas didn't do it may simply be a sign of how this common sense of natural law reasoning has fled from the reflexes and the modes of writing, even from some of our friends who would like to take the natural law seriously. And we can understand now how we find many conservative judges who express their reverence for the idea of natural law, but curiously expressed earnest doubts on whether judges should be applying natural law in their decisions. What has fled here is the recognition that the natural law is not floating in the sky. It's woven in with the very principles of practical judgment that judges are compelled to use every day. They're bound up with what James Wilson, John Marshall, Alexander Hamilton referred to as those axioms that underlie everything we can reliably know. To ask whether judges can get through the day without using the moral reasoning of the natural law is like asking, can I order the coffee without using syntax? But what may be revealed here is the deep vice that's settled in on what has been called these days conservative jurisprudence, namely a strong inclination to avoid reasoning about the moral substance of the case and call that by the pejorative of substantive due process, as though it were somehow illegitimate to address the moral substance on which the case pivots. And so in that classic case of Roe versus Wade, the lawyers from Texas offered in their briefs the most elegant argument, drawing on the most updated form, data from the embryology, woven with principled reasoning. And some of us, in a seminar we run of judges and professors, some of us were jolted when we looked back on those rich briefs and found that nothing in the data or argument of those briefs were taken up by the dissenting opinions. Justices Rehnquist and White simply fell back on what has become the cliched conservative argument that abortion is nowhere mentioned in the text of the Constitution. We would hear that argument again from other friends among the conservative judges when it came to the litigation challenging the character of marriage. In one notable case, I was urging a lawyer defending the laws on marriage in one of the states to cite some of the substantive arguments made in defense of marriage as the union of one man and one woman, arguments made by Robbie George, with Sheriff Girgis, with our friend Ryan Anderson, perhaps some of my own arguments on the family of the laws. But the lawyer was emphatic in wanting to avoid those substantive arguments altogether. He wanted to fall back on the conventional line that marriage was nowhere mentioned in the Constitution, and therefore it was illegitimate for federal judges to pronounce any constitutional rights to same-sex marriage. And yet marriage had not been mentioned in the Constitution in 1967, when the Supreme Court struck down the laws that barred marriage across racial lines. This was an instance of racial discrimination. The decision could have been made without saying a word about marriage. Nevertheless, the court, in reaching that case, proclaimed a constitutional right to marry, which became parlayed in time into a right of same-sex marriage. One wonders how things might have been different if a legislature in the 1960s had decided, in a surge of liberal sympathy, that poor black families were suffering with too many children, and so black people should be given this useful freedom to order abortions, even as the laws continue to forbid abortions to everyone else. I could see an African-American male going to court to save his unborn child and claiming rightly that this was a withholding of the equal protection of the laws for unborn black infants. The conservative judges then may have discovered that they couldn't deal with the subject of abortion as they would come to deal with the subject of marriage, even though it was never mentioned in the text of the Constitution. The Supreme Court has before it now the case of a funeral director in Michigan who decided that he saw himself as a woman, and his presence with grieving families was seen as unsettling. And now we wonder, what will the conservative justices do? Will they simply invoke lexicons and periodicals of the 1960s to show that when Congress banned discriminations based on sex in the Civil Rights Acts, it could not have meant to cover transgenderism and what people simply felt their sex to be? But that view is already being contested by people who call themselves textualists. The conservative judges could possibly take another path. They could cite the hard evidence to show that whatever people thought sex to mean in 1964, the differences between males and females were rooted deeply in objective evidence on how we are constituted in structures and hormones. That is the argument that answers the question. But if the conservative judges run true to course, they'll try to take the low door under the wall and argue rather about the way most legislators understood the meaning of sex in 1964, and that position in time will give way to the more expansive view of sex in our own day. Not long after the Supreme Court decision Obergefell versus Hodges installing same-sex marriage, I was in touch with a fine professor of law who had given us critical help in drafting the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996. I was trying to elicit his help in the first stages of an effort to counter, to modify that decision in Obergefell. I was taken aback when he declined the invitation. He thought that the help here was useless, that the issue has now been lost. There's no point of expending any more genius in this cause. But when our friends say that it's all over now, that the issue has been lost, do they really mean that the powerful argument in favor of marriage as we've known it, the union of one man and one woman, do they mean that that argument has been refuted and shown to be wrong? But if our argument has not been refuted, then the argument is not over. And if that argument is not over, the war is not over. It falls to us. It falls to us rather to make the case anew, to make it more clearly, perhaps in a more disarming way, but make it with a touch or flair that gets the argument through. With that move to protect the child who survived the abortion, we sought to test the premises of the doctrines on abortion in the most modest but telling way. and begin with a challenge that would readily recruit the sentiments of most people in this country, even people who call themselves pro-choice. When it came to marriage, a comparable proposal came to hand. It's called the defense of monogamous marriage. And it works by simply reenacting the two main components of our Defense of Marriage Act with these refinements: that the federal government will regard as a marriage the legal union of only two people, that no state should be obliged to respect a marriage coming in from abroad of more than two people. If the Supreme Court strikes this down, it will be virtually licensing and promoting polygamy. But if it sustains this bill, it will be accepting what it denied in the Windsor case in the run-up to Obergefell, for it would confirm now that the Congress may indeed legislate on the matter of abortion. A critical point. Jeff Bell managed to get a conversation with a key aide to the then Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. And he was quite intrigued by the bill, for he was no way predicting how the Democrats would move here. They seemed to be geared to vote against any bill that would enact a restriction or apply any reproach on what people do with their sexual lives. Jeff was told then that if we could get a sponsor for that bill, the Speaker would consider bringing it to the floor. Well, then the assignment fell to me. And I had extended interviews in succession with two conservative congressmen who shared our views on marriage, Randy Forbes of Virginia, Tim Huliskamp of Kansas. But both men were facing tough primaries. Other issues were coming to the fore, and both men lost their primaries. And there the matter stopped, and then the Democrats took control of the House. And yet, even if they hadn't, it was clear that even conservatives like Randy Forbes and Tim Huliskamp were nervous about taking on an issue that makes them the target of the most hateful attacks. It will still require a measure of courage to take a stand here in public and make the argument. And it will be all the harder because the other side will not take this modest measure as disarming, for they'll grasp instantly where it leads. And we know from experience that they'll be keenly attentive to the premises planted in the bill. The most striking evidence on that point came out dramatically in our own move years ago to pass the most modest first step on abortion, the bill simply to protect the life of the child who survives the abortion, the so-called Born Alive Infants Protection Act. That was my baby, as folks should know. It began with something I wrote for the debating kit of the first President Bush. I see Margie and Marty are here, the Dannenfeld. Margie was with me going door to door on the Hill 30 years ago as we were trying to gender support for that measure. I was given the honor of leading the testimony of that bill in the House. And with me that day was my beloved pal, Robbie George, who understood so well the deeper purpose of that modest bill. But so too did the opponents of the bill. Our own allies, like our dear Henry Hyde, couldn't see what was so valuable in making a move so modest. But Henry and our National Right to Life allies were just struck with astonishment and delight when on the day we opened the hearings, the National Organization of Women came out in opposition to this bill to protect the child born alive. And here we encountered what turned out to be a lasting lessons, that our adversaries understood what we're doing better than our own friends. For they understood the principle that lay at the heart of the thing. And if they didn't, we laid out the premises for them. That the child does not undergo a change of species in the womb and by birth, that the laws on homicide have never depended on the height, the weight, the age of the victim, or the location. And if we're clear that the child marked for abortion has never been anything other than a human being, then we'll be coming back to ask, what's different about that same child 5 minutes earlier, 5 hours earlier, 5 days earlier, 5 months earlier? We can unravel your whole position, and they knew it. And we tried to persuade you step by step, And if we couldn't persuade you to the next step, then we'd say, well, out of that volume of 1.3 million abortions a year, if we could rescue a handful of lives, we would not count that as anything trifling. Now, our friendly nemesis, Jerry Nadler, busy now. Jerry was besieged by the feminists and council. Just go along with this modest bill instead of raising the kind of ruckus that only draws attention to the bill. The bill was then floating through, drawing no attention from the media. But we are not interested in having a lopsided box score, 380 to 50. We wanted the argument to draw attention to the issue. What we didn't recognize, I tell you now, in our naivety, is that the bill would be subjected to the most thoroughgoing blackout by the major media, including Fox News, a blackout that continues to this day as we try, in the latest bill, to restore the penalties that were dropped from that original bill and whose omission made that bill virtually impossible to enforce. We sought then to draw out the argument and raise the level of tension by going back to an old device, adding a preamble to the bill to explain the premises and the purpose. And so we'd say, it doesn't make sense to us that you would vote for a bill of this kind unless you conceded that even that child marked for an abortion has a claim to the protection of the law that cannot pivot on whether anyone wants her. And in that case, it must be that the child must have some intrinsic dignity that does not depend on whether she serves the interests of anyone else. Now, if we have that wrong, we'll amend it. Are you protecting the child because it pleases you to protect her? And you would cease to protect her when it ceases to please you? Well, if that's your position, put it up. Let's vote on it. Well, we did raise the level of tension, but it was among the Republicans, not the Democrats. The pro-choice Republicans threatened to join with the Democrats in closing down the House in the middle of a presidential election if we went to the floor with those inflammatory findings. And our dear friend Henry Hyde went along in a decision of high political prudence, that in order to preserve a pro-life Congress, we needed a pro-life Republican majority. To preserve a pro-life Republican majority, we may have to go to the rescue of pro-choice Republicans like Steve Kuykendall, hanging on by a thread in New Jersey, in LA. And so for the good of the pro-life cause, Henry let those key premises be deleted. But that first point I mentioned was just the opener. And it led on to the point that was the most critical of all in our judgment for affecting, to pick up Frank, the structure of the constitutional order in which this issue of abortion arises. It's the most important for us now, even now, as we come in with the new version of the bill. That point marked an attempt to restore the sense of the separation of powers as Lincoln understood them. And there we drew on an old decision of John Marshall in Cohens versus Virginia, where he said any question that arises under the constitutional laws of the United States must come within the reach of the judicial branch. And we said a corollary must be that any decision that comes within the reach of the judicial branch must come within the reach of the legislative branch at all. So that if the court can articulate a new right, a right to abortion, the legislative branch must be able to vindicate that same right on the same clause in the Constitution where the court claims to find it and filling it out, marking its limits. The one thing that should not be tenable under this Constitution is that the court can articulate a new right and then assign to itself a monopoly of the legislative power in shaping that right. Okay. Well, thank you for that. What we offered was merely a restatement of the logic of the separation of powers. And we asked our friends just to ponder for a moment, if you would, what a profound effect that simple point would have made for our law and politics. Just consider What would have been different in 1973 if Justice Brennan and his colleagues knew that if they loosed upon this country this new right to abortion and made abortion an issue in our national politics, what if they knew that the judges themselves could not keep control of this issue? That would be in the hands of Congress, and the disposition of the Congress at the time was to come down on this one, to scale it back. And if Justice Brennan had been aware of that, he probably wouldn't have been so quick to move that decision. And if he'd held back, we would not have had the advent of this issue, which has poisoned our politics and converted confirmation hearings into occasions of the most vilest personal attacks. We brought that finding back as part of our new bill to restore the penalties. The penalties were stripped for the sake of averting a veto from Bill Clinton, something I didn't think we had to do. But our friend Trent Franks in the House rushed to bring out the stripped version of our bill, but he didn't provide that critical legislative finding. And yet, in a meeting back in January 2018, Franks and Senator Jim Lankford promised that they would try to get that passage in the bill, in the Senate at least, and bring it back to the House in conference. And for our own part, we said, if you can't lay out the reasons in this way, could you give us just one sentence? This one. The Congress proposes that whatever the Supreme Court established in Roe versus Wade, the Congress cannot believe that the court meant to declare a right that extends beyond the pregnancy and entails nothing less than the right to kill a child born alive. Give us that sentence, I said, and you would have established a key point, that the constitutional judgment arises from an ongoing conversation among the branches, and the political branches do have a critical authority in shaping the meaning of rights under the Constitution. At supper one night, I gave this briefing to our friend Mike Lee. He lit up and said, oh my God, this is exactly what we need. Where's it been? I had a meeting also with a senator I've known since he was a student of Robbie George's, the redoubtable Ted Cruz. He read the memorandums and saw the verse at once, but he alerted me to the point that explains why none of these senators has been able to make good on his promises or on our hopes here. As Ted Cruz pointed out, as a matter of collegial courtesy, no one here would presume to add this finding to the text of the bill without the assent of the senator who introduced that bill in the first place. But there was the catch. For as it turned out, none of us was able to get an appointment to meet with that senator. Quite apart from my own calls, he would not respond to 2 calls from a former student of mine of the Republican leadership, whose family sprang from the senator state of Nebraska. Robbie George, who's come to know the senator well, also tried to arrange an appointment. That too elicited no response. The senator evidently had in his busy life projects far more beckoning than the legislative work of getting hearings for this bill, inviting the nurses to come in to tell their story, and collaborating with other colleagues in shaping the bill and bringing it to the floor. He was busy on the road promoting one of his books. Well, as Pope Francis said, and perhaps it was Bill Clinton, who am I to judge? In any case, the moment was lost. The House in January of 2018 passed the bill overwhelmingly, with every Republican voting for it and 177 Democrats, all but 6, voting against the bill to protect children born alive. But Senator Sass did manage to get the bill onto the floor of the Senate for vote. He introduced the bill anew with the new Congress, but he missed the chance to bring the bill to the floor when passage would have enacted the bill. Or even if the bill failed, he could have forced the Democrats running in states carried by Donald Trump to declare themselves on this bill before the election. Well, he's an engaging man, I'm sure. But Lincoln famously said to General McClellan, if you're not inclined to use that army we've given you, would you mind if I borrowed it for a while? And so if Senator Sass decides that he's really interested in this grinding business of persuading colleagues and shepherding a bill through passage, that he's more interested in using the Senate as a bully pulpit. There are others you've seen who may be more interested in taking up this cause and getting it done the right way. But anyone who takes it now does this in a country in which there's been a striking decline in the willingness or the capacity of people to engage any longer in a serious exchange of reason and evidence on such matters as abortion, climate change, even transgenderism, with mainline medical organizations giving in now to slogans that are at odds with the deepest objective truths about the way in which the human person is constituted by nature. And in this new climate of non-discourse, even the challenge to engage in a debate is taken as a sign of bigotry. I'm afraid that Nick Bell encountered this new climate in a way that foretells the future, unless we can summon again the arts of making the case, but even more important, the nerve to challenge and demand the argument. George Burns used to say, the problem with this country is that the people who are most qualified to be president are all too busy driving cabs and cutting hair. And in that respect, the one notable figure I know who's fearless about making the argument, but make it with charm in a way that disarms even the truculent, well, that fellow is too busy teaching courses at Princeton and serving on every damn conservative board in the country. I had the chance to weigh in on the recent controversy over the question of conservatives in the culture. The controversy marked by the encounter between my friend Sohrab Ahmari and David French. And what we have here, I think, simply confirms the state of things I marked in my book containing that memoir of our experience in moving the Born Alive bill through the Congress. The conservatives seem ever looking for that low door under the wall, some way of resisting the liberal wave while being too diffident or too timid to challenge the premises of the other side, whether on abortion, transgenderism, or same-sex marriage. But we might ask with Herman Cain, how's all this been working for us? Or as Stan Evans used to say, the problem with pragmatism is that it doesn't work. At the end of my book, Natural Rights, the Right to Choose, with the memoir of that Born Alive Act, I sought to convey some of our frustration, but I sought also to convey, to encourage our friends to see what was plainly before us and summon the nerve to do what needs to be done. 17 years later, the lessons still hold. And with your forgiveness, I'd make my last words to you tonight the last words of that book. I said this: a political class that has lost the sense that reasons matter is a political class that may serve in positions as officers of state, and yet its members will have lost their vocation. For at times the need to clarify the principles entails the need to stage the confrontation or the debate, and that may indeed involve at times the need to pick a fight. A political class that is persistently reluctant to show that spirited nature will produce not merely a politics that is banal, but one that is denatured. For in removing the conflict or removing the argument, we may be gently removing as well the moral substance. Aristotle remarked in one of his most memorable observations that if the art were in the material, then ships would be springing fully crafted from trees. But ships were not part of the world of causation, produced through the workings of the laws of nature. Ships were part of a world governed by design. by the awareness of ends and the shaping of reasons, we may be bringing forth now a political class more and more detached from the sense that there's any particular importance in compelling the other side to come out with their reasons and claim them as their own. And to a political class molding itself in that way, we may not only ask, well, where's the reason that gives meaning to political life? But where in all of that is the art? Where do we find the distinctive hand that shows your work? Where do we find a design that marked your understanding, the touch that reflects the experience you had cultivated? And where finally do we find the impression lingering through time that you were here? Thanks very much. Wow. Thank you.